Good morning, everyone. It is the 1st of November 2020. This is Dr. Deepak Natarajan. I am a senior cardiologist practicing in Delhi. I am, in fact, an interventional cardiologist. But because I have studied medicine, because I have done general medicine from the Delhi University, I have a grip on immunology, microbiology, virology, and also epidemiology. In fact, you will be happy to know that when I graduated from Maulana Azad Medical College, the marks which I got for public health were the highest in my tally of marks on graduation. So therefore, I more than imagine that I have some knowledge about this virus. I'm mentioning my name for the first time because some very dear friends of mine have said that you must mention your name also when you begin your videos. So here we go again. The position or the situation in England is quite confused and very grim. The Prime Minister is on the brink of clamping another lockdown, which he will declare, I think, tomorrow. This is largely a reaction to his advisors, and this group is called SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Now, SAGE has come out with these figures that almost 97% of England's population is still vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus, and that the mortality rate is 1%. Now, both these numbers are terribly wrong. They are absolutely incorrect because the fatality rate is just 0.2%, and even the WHO has acknowledged that the infection fatality rate is 0.3%. 0.3% means that if 1,000 people are infected, only 3 will die. An IFR of 0.2% means that if 1,000 people are infected, only 2 will die. And the 0.2% figure comes from John Ioannidis, who is a professor of epidemiology from Stanford. And this has been published by no less than the WHO on its website. So we have figures of 0.2% fatality rate. Of course, the infection fatality rate in Delhi is much less. It is lesser than 0.1%, keeping in mind that almost 60 million people have been infected in Delhi, and the mortality today is still less than 6,500 people because of COVID-19. We have seroprevalence figures. They have dipped from 30% to 25%, but 25% is still a very large number. This means that 1/4 of Delhi's population is definitely infected. So out of 200 lakh people, 50 lakh people are definitely infected in Delhi. And this is an understatement because a lot of people who have mild symptoms will not produce antibodies, and so therefore we will not detect them. So we can presume another 10-15% people are infected. So that brings up the figure to almost 60 lakh people infected, or 6 million people infected in Delhi. So coming back to England, Johnson is on the verge of another lockdown in which almost everything will be shut down except for schools and colleges and universities and nurseries. Takeaways will stay open, but pubs, restaurants, offices will stay closed. People will be allowed for exercise outside their homes. The situation is worse in Slovakia. In Slovakia, which was a part of erstwhile Czechoslovakia, the Prime Minister has declared that everyone in that country, it is a small country, a population of just about 4.5 million, that is 45 lakhs, will have to be tested for the coronavirus or the Chinese virus. The test will be a rapid antigen test, which would give a result in half an hour, 1 hour's time. And people who do not undergo this test will either not be allowed to go outside their homes or would be asked to pay a fine of almost 1 lakh rupees, that is 1,000 euros. So that is the situation in Europe. In fact, the situation in Europe suddenly is becoming very, very grim. Winter is supposed to be very dark this time. And because almost every country is now angling for lockdowns, that includes Spain, Italy, France, and of course England. Germany also is included in that. Now these figures which have been provided by SAGE that 1% population could die and that 93% people are still vulnerable in the United Kingdom is palpably false and incorrect. And I will give you the reasons for that. You will have to concentrate on what I am saying. Now, we already know by multiple studies, by German studies, by American studies, by studies from Singapore, which have been published in respected journals, in fact, the best journals, which are called Science and Nature. And these papers have shown consistently that almost at least 30% of the population which has not been infected by COVID-19 has antibodies and has T cells which react to the Chinese virus, which means previous infections by coronaviruses, the common cold coronaviruses, which are the cousins of the new novel coronavirus, can produce T cells which can protect us against future infections by COVID-19. If it does not point blank prevent a further infection, it definitely will tone down the impact of the virus. Now, 30% of the population, whether in England or whether in Delhi, already has T cells against the Chinese virus. And now, if we take the mortality figures from England, that is 46,000 people have died, and we take the infection fatality rate of 0.2%, this means that almost 23 million people in England have been infected. Now, 23 million people in England means 30% of their population. In fact, 33% of the British population. So now we have 33% people infected, 30% already infected and carrying T cells against the virus. Now we have another number, that is children. Children below the age of 14 years in England are almost 10% of the population. Let's take them as being 8% of the total population. Now this 8% of the British population or the English population is almost invulnerable to the Chinese virus, and that is the situation in India also, that children, I presume there'd be far more children below the age of 14 years, and these children are almost like Superman or Superwoman. They are completely and absolutely invulnerable to the Chinese virus. So now we have a figure of 70%. Let me repeat, 30% already infected and carrying T cells against the novel Chinese coronavirus, 30% infected and carrying antibodies, and this can be calculated by the fact we have mortality figures and we have antibody figures from Delhi, right? And we have another 8% or 10% of children who are more or less invulnerable to the Chinese virus. So we have a figure of 70%. So this means that 70% of the population in England or in Delhi is almost well protected against the Chinese virus. So this means only 30% is now left. The remaining 30% is possibly vulnerable to the Chinese virus. And of these, again, there would be a sizable proportion of people who are elderly. And therefore, we have to focus only on that fraction of people, on that proportion of people who are above the age of 60 years. So these figures, which are being provided by SAGE and by people from Imperial College, are rather exaggerated and quite illogical as far as I am concerned, and as far as a lot of other scientists and doctors are concerned. These figures are misleading, and I think Johnson, if he clamps down another lockdown, which he is going to do, would cause irreparable harm to the British economy. Already they are on the brink, or have already borrowed 372 billion pounds this year, which is opposed to the usual borrowing of 55 billion pounds a year. So that is a huge figure. The fall in the GDP of England is probably the highest in the United Kingdom. 750,000 jobs have already been lost in England in the first phase of this pandemic, and many lakhs, many hundreds of thousands jobs would be lost again. And that's the reason why a lot of business heads, a lot of corporate heads are very nervous about this lockdown. People are still trying to present some logic, some reason to the Prime Minister, but he, I think, is overwhelmed by some factors, and these factors are very mysterious. Of course, we have our famous Mr. Hancock, their health minister, who has absolutely no clue as to what is an antibody, what is a T cell, what is an IgG, what is an IgM, what is an IgA, and what is innate immunity and what is adaptive immunity. He has no degree in the sciences, no degree in biology, no degree in medicine, but of course he is the expert in the United Kingdom who is unleashing these lockdowns every month. Now this lockdown, the new one, is supposed to be on till December 1st, but one can presume that at the rate matters are progressing, the lockdown will be extended, because Sage has very piously said that mortality would carry on, that 85,000 English people would die up to March. So I don't see any loosening of this lockdown. And I'm worried for America also, because they are waiting for the results to come out of their election. The election is on the 3rd of November, just 2 days from now. And once the elections come out, then if Biden becomes the president of the United States of America, we can be sure that the lockdowns would be clamped very vigorously, very enthusiastically, and with great finesse in the United States also. And a lot of people now are wondering whether the West is not merely waning, but actually is on its knees, at least economically. China is surging ahead. The economy is much more sound than that of the West. And I do not say that within 10 years, but much earlier. That means within the next couple of years or 4 or 5 years, the leading economy of this world will be China. So therefore, we have to be very, very careful. The government is mulling its moves. I think it is waiting for the Bihar elections to be over to decide as to what should be the next step. But the government is exquisitely aware of the catastrophic economic situation in India. So I have my fingers crossed that the government does not go for a sledgehammer lockdown once again, because that would be disastrous. The United Nations has already said that more than 450 million people will be below severe poverty in the next 1 year, that 30 million Africans already are below the severe poverty line. Severe poverty is defined as less than $2 earnings in 1 day. Now, I am talking about England because England is a classic example of how this virus should not be dealt with. You see, the point is that a few days back, I was not going to mention this, but now I am compelled to talk about this article, this insight scoop by the London Times. I will talk about the London Times later, but let me set the stage first for you. All these years, I know right from my childhood till where I stand today, that means almost more than 6 decades, we have been bombarded by the English and particularly by the West, which have complained again and again and again, very, very loudly about the atrocities committed by the Russians and by the Chinese, and of course, by the Nazis. Now, I must point out, and you will agree, that the Nazis, though were pretty obscene, they never attacked their own people. They never attacked Nazis. And they did put people behind bars and in concentration camps. These were Germans who did not subscribe to their philosophy. But as a blanket measure, they never attacked their own people. The Russians did, Stalin did, and we are told that Stalin killed millions of his own people in the gulags of Siberia. And the Chinese, of course, did. Mao Zedong, the chairman of China, at one point in the early 50s, publicly proclaimed that, acknowledged, in fact, that he, or rather the Communist Party, had killed 700,000 Chinese, whom they considered to be counter-revolutionaries, and therefore they had to be executed for the future of the Chinese people. And somewhere in the 1950s, Mao made his famous speech in which he said that let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 thoughts contend, which in other words, was that he was encouraging people to come out with criticisms of his government, to come out with what they thought was inadequacies or wrongdoings of the government or the inefficiencies of his government. But when people did come out with critiques, and there were thousands of them, they were summarily executed, right? And I mentioned this because this was cruelty at its maximum. This was extreme cruelty. This was, almost ensnaring, seducing people to their deaths. And it is said that, again, lakhs and lakhs, and in English that would be millions of Chinese were killed by the Chinese themselves. Now, having set the stage, I must talk to you about the protocols set by the English for their own people. Now, I repeat, if you read, if you were a person of my generation, we read Biggles, we read Gimlet by Captain W.E. Jones, we read comics of British commandos, of English commandos and American commandos, the American Marines who fought the Nazis. And of course, there was a huge moral high by the West. I mean, they were safely ensconced in their moral superiority because they were not cruel people. Now, I repeat this because the London Times, yes, now this is not Russian propaganda. This is not from TASS. This is not from a tabloid published in Moscow. This is not from a Chinese news agency. This is from the London Times, which is considered to be one of the most conservative newspapers of England, which is one of the oldest and respected newspapers of England. And this brought out a story. The London Times or the Sunday Times brought out a story, an insight revelation, which was published front page last week, which clearly documented the fact that in the first phase of the current pandemic, the English government officially had issued orders. This was a protocol which it had issued orders, and mark my words, these orders were that any person above the age of 80 years was not to be provided intensive care treatment, right? Anyone above the age of 75 years who was considered frail was not to be given intensive care treatment. Anyone above the age of 60 years in England, these are English people, mark you. They're not talking about Chinese or Russians or Africans. They're talking about their own people. Anyone above the age of 60 years who had an infirmity or who was frail was not to be provided intensive care treatment. Now, what can be more harrowing than this? This is official. And the document was made apparently by a professor of critical care medicine in Imperial College, right? Now, I wouldn't name the professor. For that, you have to do some work. You must do some efforts to pick out the name of this professor. But of course, the professor is not to be blamed. He himself is not to be blamed because he brought out this grandiose protocol wherein the elderly were not to be provided officially treatment. Ambulance drivers were told, they were discouraged from picking up old people whom they considered to be having COVID-19. GPs were urged not to refer patients who had COVID-19, who were considered to be very sick. They were urged not to send these patients to hospitals. They had some kind of a score based on the heart rate, the blood pressure, the oxygen saturation, the respiratory rate, consciousness of the patient, the temperature, and of course to this protocol was added three things, and this was age, an underlying condition, and frailty of the patient. So once you were above the age of 80, you probably had a count of more than 8, and once you had a count of 8, you were not to be given critical care treatment. So therefore, thousands were dying. In fact, 26,000 people died in care homes in England. 25,000 deaths occurred in homes, that means in residences, and only 8,000 deaths occurred in hospital. So that is a total of about 59,000. Yes, 59,000 excess deaths. These are not normal deaths. These were excess deaths. That is 56,000 more people died than the average which was set up for the last 5 years. Of these 59,000 people who died, 51,000 died outside hospitals. of the 45,000 people who died of COVID-19, definitely, as per their medical certificates, only 10% or less than 10% were given intensive care treatment, critical care treatment. The reason behind was that we must protect the NHS at any cost. Yes, we were not here to protect the old. We were not here to protect the most vulnerable, the most weak, the weakest of our community. We are here to protect the NHS so that we do not get our hospitals overwhelmed by patients. We have to make sure that the young survive. And even then we knew that the young were less vulnerable, that the young were stronger and that they could fight this virus. We now know almost for a certainty that the death rate, the fatality rate below the age of 70 years is just 0.05%. And this is by the Benitez data, right? 0.05% means that only 2 people die out of 1,000 infected if you are below the age of 70 years. Despite this, the Brits, and this was of course official, this was approved by the Health Minister, Hancock, and of course by the Prime Minister, that the elderly above the age of 75, above the age of 80 were not to be given critical care treatment. Now, I'm wondering whether we have a document like this emerging again in the coming surge of cases. That would be horrifying. And as I said, the document was actually prepared by a critical care professor of Imperial College. I will not name him, but I will give you a hint. We had a very famous cricketer. He captained England, and in fact, I think he won the first series against England in India. This was a gentleman called Nari Contractor. I think he's still alive. Nari had led India to the West Indies in 1962. We had 2 tests. The first 2 tests we were beaten pretty badly. Following the first 2 tests, we played a first-class match against Barbados, and there was this brute of a bowler called, well, I won't name him, and he was bowling against Contractor. Contractor was the captain of the Indian team, and he was an opener, and alongside him was, I think, Rusi Surti, and Contractor in that over, the 5th ball struck Contractor behind his right ear. Contractor was a southpaw, which means he was a left-hander. So therefore, the bouncer hit him on the back of his head. He crumpled immediately, but was not unconscious. Right there, blood was coming out of his nose and his ears. I think Buddhi Kundran, who was the wicketkeeper, said that they could hear the crack of the skull from the dressing room. Contractor was taken out of the stadium. He got to be operated twice. There was a big hematoma. The skull was cracked. There was a blood clot. 4 people donated blood. 3 were Indian cricketers, Paul Umbrega, Bapu Nadkarni, and Chandu Bode. The 4th contributor, donator, was the captain of the West Indian team, Frank Worrell. Contractor survived, but never again played Test cricket. The selectors were prudent enough not to allow him. The reason that he got struck on the back of his head was that in those days there were no helmets, which brings me to the point that Gavaskar, I mean, he is all over the place, and sometimes it gets irritating hearing him talk and giving comments on just about every aspect of the game. But the fact remains that Gavaskar, throughout his career, played without a helmet, and he was, mark you, probably the best batsman we have ever produced. He may not like it, you may not like it, you may think Tendulkar, you may call Virat Kohli, but Gavaskar, because he played most of his career without a helmet and scored centuries after centuries, was an outstanding batsman and probably the best batsman we have ever produced. Now, I am mentioning cricket. I mentioned Nadi Contractor because then you can figure out who bowled to Nadi Contractor, who cracked his skull, and from that you will get the name of the chap who had made that document, in which it was clearly stated that if a patient was above the age of 80 years, he was to be denied admission to a British hospital. And one hopes and one prays that this is not repeated by the English, right? Because now it is on record that the English were prepared to kill their own, and especially their oldest and their weakest and their most vulnerable section of the population. Which brings me back to the Imperial College. The Imperial College has a preprint. That means it has a paper which is being right now reviewed. It is yet to be published, which says that in their trial, in their study, the antibodies level fell from 6% of the population studied to 4.4%. That is, there was a drop of 26.5% in antibodies level. Now, this paper, as I've said, is yet to be published. They have data on almost 16,000 people who were tested, but this was a test at home. The device which was used was a yes or no device. This did not tell us the quantum of the antibodies, nor did this tell us the quality of the antibodies. So therefore, it is not the ultimate information or data on antibodies. It has been, of course, parroted. It has been repeated by many mainstream newspapers across the world that antibodies wane after infections by COVID-19. But this is common knowledge. Antibodies do wane, antibodies do come down, but in our bodies we have other immunity members also. I have already told you that we have T cells which can combat a future infection. We also have memory B cells which, in the event of a future infection, will churn out antibodies against the future infection. And this, of course, has not been discussed in this paper. What it says is that in the case of health workers, the antibodies did not come down, and also in people, the young people between the ages of 18 and 24, the levels of antibodies came down by about 15%. The fall in the levels of antibodies was the highest in people above the age of 75 years. The fall was by almost 39 or 40%. On an average, the fall was 27%. Now, I will not be, alarmed by this data because we already have two excellent papers, and one paper I will elaborate upon. This has been published in Science on, I think, the 23rd of October. In fact, no, sorry, it has been published on the 28th of October, so therefore it's just 4 days old. This is a paper from Mount Sinai in New York, and this has been a very, very rigorous study on 30,000 people who had antibodies. These people were divided into 3 groups. The first group, which was just 7%, had low levels of antibodies. The other was 22%, which had moderate levels of antibodies, and 70% of these people had high levels of antibodies. Now, they had defined these antibodies on the titer levels. I will not talk about that because that will only confuse you. In simple English, we had 93% of people who had moderate to high levels of antibodies. And what they found out was that these antibodies persisted for at least 5 months. They actually followed 121 people who had antibodies tested. They were blood donors, and they were donating blood only because they had at least moderate levels of antibodies. That means a titer of 1:320. And these people were tested again after 2 or 3 months, and then again after 5 months. And this study showed that antibodies levels, though did come down by a small extent, but this was not significant. The other study is from Arizona, which has been published in a journal called Immunity, and this has been published on the 3rd or 4th of October. That means the first week of October. And this study again tested people for the levels of antibodies against the spike protein, antibodies against the nucleocapsid of the virus, and they showed that antibodies levels remained significantly for as long as 7 months after the first test. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do be rest assured that antibodies are there, antibodies are produced, and they last for at least 5 to 7 months. And apart from these antibodies, we are carrying T cells, and these T cells may have been manufactured by previous coronavirus infections. And also that if you are a young person, even without any antibodies or without any T cells, you are strong enough to fight this virus without the aid of any medicine or without the aid of any vitamins or plasma. Now, the levels of antibodies are important because there is an ICMR trial on plasma. This was a big randomized study of almost 600 patients, and this has been published in the British Medical Journal. But there are two big flaws or weaknesses of this trial. The first is that the antibodies levels were very, very low. The antibodies levels were just 1:40, and as I have just mentioned, that the levels should be ideally around at least 1:320. That's the first thing. The study by the ICMR had plasma which had almost no levels of antibodies, so therefore they were actually giving placebos to these patients. And the second thing was that the blood plasma was administered almost a week or 10 days after onset of symptoms. You must remember that plasma has to be administered within 3 days, in fact within 48 hours of onset of symptoms, because the antibodies then, if present to a moderate extent at least, would be effective as an antiviral against the Chinese virus. Now, I think that is enough for today. Do have a good Sunday. If you think you have gained some information on the Chinese virus, on the novel coronavirus, or on COVID-19, please do press the bell icon. Please do share this video, and please do put down at least some comment on the video, because that keeps me going. So I will summarize once again that the COVID-19 is here to stay. It will be here for the next 2, 3, 4 years. A lockdown is not a blanket. Lockdown is not an antidote. It is not a medicine. This is a cure which would be having worse effects than the virus itself. A lot of us, a large proportion of us, already have immunity against the virus. And more importantly, we must maintain caution. We must wear masks in crowded places. We must maintain distance, and we must keep washing hands, especially because Diwali is already upon us. So having summarized, this is goodbye. Do have a good Sunday. Thank you very much for listening to me.